Hey guys, welcome back to Creators of the Lost Art. My name is Ron and welcome back to my shop. And I have a special treat for you today. You see, it's going to be the first time that you guys have seen and that I have attempted to build something that I consider fancy. I do lots of woodworking here, but nothing furniture-wise that I consider fancy. But you see, Mandy, my wife, works really hard on producing things for our small business, like these freeze-dried treats, her herbal tinctures and things like that. And my number 3 fan and friend and mentor, Jason, offered us a space at the local gym that we could set up our little booth and have some passive traffic through there and make people aware that we are producing these things. So I'm gonna try to create something that's pretty fancy that we could set up in the gym, but also take from there and go somewhere else if we needed to. So this is going to be a lot of fun, a lot of challenge, so enjoy. I started by cutting the maple boards down to more manageable lengths to run through my planer. And Skeeter was thoroughly unimpressed. I don't have a joiner, so I MacGyvered using a straight piece of plywood, some double-sided tape, in order to cut a straight edge on this walnut. And as I was setting the table saw to cut 2-inch wide strips, Penelope was showing me the progress she's made in her flying lessons. I taped all the pieces together with painter's tape so that I could cut them to the same length at the same time. And because I was winging it and didn't have an actual drawing, I put the pieces together and clamped them where I wanted them, and then used a razor knife to cut a sharp edge where I wanted to start my half laps. I also used a Sharpie to label the parts being cut off so that I didn't accidentally cut the wrong ones. And the slight cut made by the razor knife was much easier to follow than just a pencil line. I learned a lesson with these new setup blocks that one side is 3/8 of an inch and the other side's a 1/2 inch. And if you set your saw to 1/2 inch and you meant to set it to 3/8 of an inch, the depth is wrong. So I fixed that here. My pieces are 3/4 of an inch thick, and half of that is 3/8 of an inch, and a half lap is half. So I cut those out at 3/8 of an inch. The lower pieces I was able to cut using the miter gauge on the table saw because they had a little bit less of an angle than a 45 degree. But the mating angles at the top were much greater than a 45, and I couldn't safely do that on the table saw, so I used my joining jig and a bunch of scrap pieces of lumber to line up where I'd made those marks with the razor knife to route out that 3/8 and that half lap. I glued up one side triangle and while it was set aside to dry, I cut a bunch of 1/4 by 1 inch strips of walnut. These are going to be used on the back of the shelf so that items won't be pushed from the front and fall off the back of the shelf. And then I used a 1/4 inch router bit to create some stop dados. They're inset about 1/4 of an inch from the back of the shelf, and they stop about 1/2 an inch from each end. And at this point, my first triangle was dry. I wanted to glue my second triangle on top of my first triangle, just in case it wasn't exactly perfectly square. It was more important that the pieces matched than it was for them to be square. Otherwise, it would have a twist and a wobble to it. I use these tiny pieces of scrap plywood and some CA glue to create clamping cauls, because every time I tightened my clamp on this severe angle, it just wanted to slide to the point, and I needed to get good pressure on it. I just knocked those cauls off later with a hammer and sanded off the little bit of veneer that was connected to the glue. After I added a 1/4 inch round over on all sides of the shelf and pre-sanded them, I later realized that I probably should have pre-finished them at this point too, just to make things a little easier later on. I taped all of my shelf backing pieces together so that I could dado out the ends of them and they could slide down in that little slot. And while I was working so hard, my lovely wife thought I might like a bowl of homemade chicken noodle soup, which I did. And then after a little shaping on these walnut strips, I used a combination of wood glue and CA glue to insert them in their slots. The CA glue dries pretty much instantly and works great as a clamp in situations where it's hard to get a clamp on something. I wanted to give the frame a more rounded appearance, so I created a plywood template that I could trace around and then cut the majority of the material off with a jigsaw. Then I clamped the template back on the sides, and using a flush trim bit in my router, I traced around that template to get the material that I didn't get with the jigsaw. This required the most serious phase of concentration. Because I can cut about as straight as the flight path of Penelope on that shop broom, I had a little bit of a gap that I had to fill up, and I used wood glue and walnut sawdust to make a homemade wood paste slurry, and it worked fine. And even using my most serious concentration phase, I had a little bit of tear out on the end grain. I fixed it by using a 1/4 inch bit, cutting it in a little bit, and then filling it with a walnut dowel. At this point, the frame was too large to fit on my drill press, so I had to break out my old homemade drill press to drill the holes for the maple dowels I'm going to be adding. Cotton swabs work great for taking things out of, say, ears and belly buttons, but it also works great for spreading glue in the holes for the dowels. Never reverse this and put wood glue in your ears or your belly button. By clamping the front of both sides together, I made sure that the shelf locations were identical on each side. And then because I had added a 1/4 inch round over on each end of the shelf, I had to use a round nose bit to cut a groove for the shelves to sit in. The only round nose bit I had was, I think, a 1/2 inch. And I needed a 5/8 of an inch. So instead of moving my fence, I just added an 1/8 inch spacer after the first pass to cut the second pass. I did that same 1/4 inch round over the whole frame, and then it was time for assembly. And then I wandered around scratching my head, wondering how I was going to put this thing together by myself. Fortunately, my bearded brother-in-law showed up and he helped me get the shelves installed. Although he kept wanting to tell me about something that was that big around and that long. I added this back support to help prevent any kind of racking. I did put screws in this, but I countersunk them and then added dowels to cover the screw heads. If you notice, I put it in 3 times before I decided to cut some spacers so that I could get it in the right place. Once the dowels were trimmed off and sanded flush, I asked my buddy Jared what I should use to finish, and he suggested Rubio Monocoat. Now, I've never used Rubio before, so Franklin came out and showed me how to apply it, gave me a few taps to speed me up. But this stuff is great. You just wipe it on, and then much like toilet paper, you just wipe it off until the paper comes back clean. right, for a guy that's not a woodworker, this turned out pretty nice for a fancy project. Mandy just came out and she loved it, which is all I really cared about. So waiting for the Rubio Monocoat to cure, and then I will go put it in place and stack it up with all these delicious freeze-dried goodies and herbal tinctures. And here it is in its new home, right next to the smelly sneakers and the sweaty athletic supporters. But it sure does dress the place up, and it looks great. Thanks for watching.